Well, thank you for coming in and listening into the webinar today. So what I'm going to do is to really run through something about the evaluation approach that we've been adopting for this work, which hopefully is familiar to people, and if it's not, then there'll be some explanation of it. And there's plenty of documentation that's been circulated previously, which we're happy to share again. And then to think a little bit about what's been achieved so far, and to share a little bit of the work that other institutions, which may include your own institutions, have been doing. And then just to spend the last bit really thinking about what we need to do moving forward towards the end of this enhancement theme. And finally, an opportunity to kind of share any kind of questions or problems, or even to tell us what's working really well. But as Alison has already said, if you want to raise any questions throughout, we can use the chat box, which should be displayed on your left-hand side. If not, there's a circle at the bottom with a little kind of speech bubble in, and that will then make the chat window display. So I'll try not to fill up too much of your time with the talking through the slides, but to give it enough kind of explanation, but to give us sufficient time before 1:15 when we'll finish to actually raise your own issues. So first of all, then, I want to kind of go over the evaluation approach which we've been taking, and you can see at the top of the slide there's the picture that was drawn from the previous TLIG, the theme leaders meeting, where they took pictorial notes, and I think that sort of that sums up some of the issues and things which we were talking about. But I've got another slide which hopefully for me works slightly more as a prompt of what I want to talk about. So first of all, we're assuming that we're focusing on evaluating impact, and so what I've been looking for in all the materials that I've been looking through, so the second year reports and the smaller case studies or smaller project evaluations that have already been submitted, is really looking around impact, but also looking about what you've been learning about the process and what we might take away about from that, and all with that view around what the role of evidence is and how we've been using evidence to enhance in some ways the student experience in our own institutions and across the sector more broadly. So the focus is on impact. Excuse me, but we've also recognised that there are a huge number of projects, so it's important to have evaluation taking place at different levels. So we introduced a range of evaluation categories. So people have identified previously where the projects are going to be evaluated in depth, which is the kind of approach I'll then describe briefly, or whether we're going to take a more light touch evaluation, or indeed some projects it's been decided not to evaluate them at all. And I think the thing about the light touch or the smaller project evaluation template is that it's very much kind of encouraging you to write and tell us whatever's been happening. And so I think that colleagues have been sharing informally some of the benefits which have been coming out of the work they're doing, but not always perhaps capturing it for the project and for the record. And that makes it much more difficult for us to kind of synthesize and draw that together and pull out the lessons. So I really encourage you to use that template or parts of that template selectively if necessary to really tell us about the things which are working in those projects that you've been working on. But in terms of the more in-depth evaluations, we've been using a theory of change and a logic change approach to the evaluation, which I suppose is an approach that encourages to really tease out the relationship between the activities, which people are usually very good at talking about and reporting on in terms of the things they've been doing, and then those longer term goals. And I think from earlier work, everyone's broadly agreed that the primary purpose of this work in the long term is to improve the student experience. There are other sort of longer term goals which are perhaps around changing the institutional culture to help both staff and students or one or other group to make better use of evidence and data. So on the left hand side of your theory of change, you've got your activity, of your logic chain, you've got your activities, and on the right hand side then you've got these kind of longer term goals. And I think the bit that's sometimes quite tricky is to articulate the relationship between those activities that you're putting in place and those longer term goals. So that's where we've been asking you to think about the short-term benefits and the medium-term outcomes. And I think the short-term benefits can be really useful to capture. They're the sort of things about what do people immediately get from participating in whatever your activity is that you put in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I show you some of the examples about how people have used their qualitative evidence to do this. So even if you don't think you've got evidence of longer term impact, at least capturing that short-term benefits is really important and helps us to understand and get that early indication of whether things are working as you thought they would. And then the medium-term outcomes is that kind of bridge between what people get from when that activity was implemented to what we and then where we're trying to go in terms of student experience or institutional culture. And quite often it involves people either changing their attitudes or changing their behavior or doing something differently. So that sometimes takes a little bit more thinking about around what it is you're actually trying to get staff or students to do differently as a result of your intervention. And once you've identified that, you can then put in place some indicators, and that really helps to show that your activity has been well received and done what you thought it would do. And then people are starting to do things differently. And then if your theory of change, which is that narrative account that spells out this relationship, if that's actually working, then even if it happens outside or beyond the life of this particular enhancement theme, then we've got good kind of evidence that it's moving in the right direction. So I think, we really need to focus on developing those medium-term outcomes as well, and if we can't get that evidence around longer-term impact, but make sure we also capture those short-term benefits. So what we've been working on in the model is creating indicators at short, medium, and longer term. And then also using a kind of a range of evidence to verify those indicators. And so we've talked about the sorts of things that people are using previously, but to use it naturally occurring data is really helpful if you can do that. So people have made good use of things like module evaluations or existing institutional surveys and data sets, but also things like staff applications or and staff annual monitoring or various other kind of documentation that kind of exists or occurs naturally within your institution. We've also thought a little bit about baselines and been quite pragmatic in the use of our baselines. So in some instances, projects have developed a baseline through the work that they've been doing. In others, there's been sort of no particular baseline required. And in others, they've been looking at either historical or comparative baselines. So either looking at now with the past or the future with the past, or looking at other courses. And that's always a little bit more tricky to do because that involves a sort of an element of matching up. But quite often the historical baseline has been quite a useful way of saying whether things have improved over time. I'll just pause briefly in case anyone wants to kind of query anything about the evaluation approach, but hopefully it's quite familiar. Okay. So I want to move on then and try to tell you a little bit about what I've seen by looking across. So we've received evaluation plans from institutions or evaluation intentions, and then we've also received year 2 reports which have some commentary on evaluation, and then we've also received a number of the smaller evaluation documents. So what we discovered from all of this was that about 74% of the projects that are taking place as part of the enhancement theme will be evaluated in some way, and just under half of those, about half of the projects will be evaluated by a light touch, and about 28 will be in depth. So that's of the total number of projects. I think it's quite interesting about the evaluation load. So some institutions, 9 of them, have decided to evaluate all of their projects. That probably reflects the fact that they've got a smaller number of projects overall, so they might have fewer bigger projects. And in some institutions, the number is as low as 25% of their projects being evaluated. But that also doesn't perhaps capture the way how people have grouped things together. So some people have lumped sort of multiple projects under one sort of project heading, and other people have split them up into smaller segments. But it is a kind of a thing to think about, and whether you have the capacity to do as much evaluation as you initially indicated, or whether you perhaps think maybe you ought to be doing a little bit more, but to make sure that we're really kind of aiming to produce evidence of impact at the different time points, the short, medium, and longer term. And obviously the collaborative clusters and the national projects are also evaluating their impact and working to do that. So we've received at this point 25 light touch evaluation reports from 11 institutions. That's only about 30%, it's slightly less than 30% of the evaluations we've expected. So that's to be expected, in the sense that obviously all the projects are still ongoing. But I think it kind of points to the fact there's still quite a lot of work to be done, and I think that's part of the takeaway message from this, really, that there's still quite a lot that needs to be worked on around evaluation over the remaining months of the project. So what did we find? Well, in the Year 2 reports, it's fair to say that progress ranges from really good progress and institutions being really confident that they will have impact to report, to institutions that are kind of currently reporting short-term benefits, and some are kind of moving towards medium-term outcomes, while other institutions are reporting delays. But I think overall there's a lack of evidence presented in the Year 2 reports. So that kind of points to the amount of work that will need to be done in terms of the final year reports that are due in next year. But there are some quite interesting reflections on the process that come through in the institutional reports, and broadly people have found the evaluation to be a useful process. I think planning evaluation in from the beginning is being seen to be useful. People have also talked about it's valuable to think explicitly and critically about the link between the activities and enhancing the student experience. And I think sometimes we start with the student experience and then we set up a set of activities, and then you can get kind of focused on the delivery of the activity rather than what it's trying to achieve. So people have identified that as being important. And also the idea that we're actually looking at identifying indicators and outcomes at different time periods. And I think some people also commented on the fact that it's useful to differentiate between outputs and outcomes. So outputs are those things that you deliver, and outcomes are the changes that have happened as a result of it. But I think broadly it's been seen to be useful. I've tried to think about what we've learned and to share some examples with you. So I've called it there are kind of different ways of operating, modus operandi, although I think that they're probably not mutually exclusive. So some people seem to be primarily using evidence to enhance practice locally. So there's an intervention, they're evaluating it, and then they're feeding that back into improving that particular intervention, while other people are putting in place local changes and then evaluating them, and then they're not feeding them back into their own intervention. Well, I'm not saying they're not feeding back into their intervention, but they're also feeding them into the wider institutional. So they're looking at institutional plans or institutional changes, or perhaps more structural changes to the institution. There's also some other learning which comes out from the institutional reports and the case studies around sort of methodological innovations, and particularly I want to highlight some of the issues around the ways that qualitative methods have been used. So here are sort of 3 examples, and I'm not sure which institutions here, so whether the examples on the screen are your institutions, but for example, there's an example from the University of Stirling where they're talking about the experience of psychology students on the student-led elective compared to staff electives. So here it's very much then that they put in place an intervention around students creating their own sort of, well, they're leading their electives rather than staff leading them, and then they've collected evidence from students, and their evidence shows that they've led to greater student involvement, so more students have got participated and attended, and greater student engagement. So that's resulted in changes in the fact that they'll continue doing this new model of working moving forward, and they'll build more student autonomy more broadly into their course from earlier on, so not just in the final year of study. So you can see how that learning from this has led to sort of improvements and some changes to that particular course. So you can sort of you can visualize that as a sort of feedback loop. And then you've got another example from Dundee where they're talking about enhancing teaching and learning through the analysis of the student-led teaching awards. So they've analysed the awards to understand what it is that students are valuing, and then that's been led, that data is then being used to inform a staff development event. So I suppose that's slightly broader, but again it's very kind of confined within the original remits of the project, that they were looking at analysing that and then using that to develop staff. And then there's an example from Shruck where they're looking at piloting a whole set of digital innovations to improve and create a more sort of active learning approach. So the teaching staff move from kind of people who transmit information to people who facilitate learning, and they've used a kind of a model of kind of interventions which are being piloted and evaluated and refined. So you can see that there's quite a lot of improvement of practice through that model. Oops, not going to. Oh, there we are. Whereas other projects, and as I say, that they're not, none of these things are kind of mutually exclusive or perfect examples, but whereas other people are not just looking at doing their work, and then improving locally, but are very much kind of doing a piece of work and seeking to influence at that kind of institutional level. So, for example, you've got about 4 or 5 examples there. At Aberdeen, they've been looking at the evaluation of the postgraduate thought student experience, and this has led to a whole set of changes which are being implemented both locally. So the learning has been, the feedback from students has improved practice locally, but it's also been fed up to those kind of structural changes around institutional processes. At Glasgow Caledonian, they've done work around their academic advising and mentoring, and they've made 10 recommendations which have been adopted at the university level. So we've been asking for these kind of things. Similarly, at Glasgow Caledonian, they've been talking about their English for academic purposes, and one of the things they've been doing is improving the consistency of English for academic purposes across the university. Going back to the Shruk example, not only have they improved the local kind of teaching and learning using these kind of technological approaches, but then they're looking at how they might roll it out on a wider scale application across the institution. So they're moving from the local to that kind of cross-institutional approach. It just said it lost the server, just lost contact there. And then the final example was from Mary's University, sorry, Queen Margaret's University. I haven't flicked between screens here. Where they've been looking at imaginative processes for a module evaluation and then feeding that into the structural changes. So they're very much working locally and collecting examples again to feed into those structural changes. So it's quite a different model of working. Some of the methodological innovations are things like how to establish a baseline. So I've mentioned this really already, but Aberdeen, they created a baseline through the project, and then they created these indicators that they can keep revisiting. So they were actually established in the first year of the project, and that allows them to measure progress over time. GCU talk about how they built questions into their existing surveys, and I think that's been quite useful. So they built questions around academic and advising and mentoring into their student experience survey, which means that they will have evidence by the end of the project about how things have changed, but it doesn't involve a huge amounts of additional data collection because the questions have been built into something that's already going on. And then there are some interesting examples around these kind of qualitative approaches that people have been using. I think it's worth thinking about the Conservatoire, where they've been really kind of using much more visual methods or much more methods that feel perhaps more appropriate in an arts setting. So they've been collecting student feedback using a video booth, which has been set up on campus for a week. And those kind of ways of collecting qualitative evidence can be quite useful, and they give you a richer and alternative source of information. But you can use much more traditional qualitative approaches like interviewing or asking people to write their feedback down and those sorts of things. And that's been really useful to demonstrate some of those short-term benefits. So at Edinburgh University, they've been using a meeting of the school directors of quality to really think about how different people are using evidence and writing their annual quality reports and talking then about the data. And then you've got a quote here from a member or a participant who's saying what they learned from it, and that's really helpful to show those kind of short-term benefits. And then what you want to see moving forward are the kind of the medium term and hopefully indicators of longer term impact. And you can see there's another comment from another person who participated about how they're going to go away and use the information. So what you're getting is that immediate feedback of how they've benefited from it, and what's really helpful here as well is talking about the intention of what people are going to go on and do. And obviously you then have the potential to go back and kind of follow that up. So the types of impact that I think we're starting to see coming out of this are the kind of the structural changes which I've defined, and we can argue about definitions, but I've defined as kind of changes to policies and practices within the institution. So I've talked about some of those examples earlier about how people are feeding upwards and creating new policies or processes or ways of doing things within the institution. There are also some sort of things which people have been able to quantify, and then there's some additional learning or unintended consequences which have been really useful to capture and have really kind of helped to both inform interventions and show the kind of what else has been going on as part of this work. There's a few examples here of quantifiable impact. So from Robert Gordon University, they've done quite a bit of work to improve the student voice. And then what they've been able to show that in the short term, this is, or in the medium term, this has resulted in an increased participation in the National Student Survey and their Student Experience Questionnaire. So they've kind of been able to measure the difference over time. So that's using a historical baseline. But then they've also been able to show that there have been improvements in student voice category of the NSS. So that's increased by 2 percentage points. And then in the particular question about it's clear how students' feedback on the course has been acted on, that's actually risen by 5 percentage points, and that's been a key part of that intervention. So that gives you that very kind of explicit kind of medium-term outcome that students can now see how it's been acted on, and then one would hope that in time that would translate to obviously improvements in the student experience more broadly. Harriet Watt have talked about various ways in which they've improved things, and what I think is notable about this is that they've tried to convert this into numbers and to help us really kind of get a grasp of what's been achieved and also to some extent what's still happening. So on their work on student surveys, they made 19 recommendations, and 7 of those have been fully implemented across the institution, and 4 have been partially implemented. But then what they've done as a result of that work is identified 37 measures which have then been tracked, so allowed to see that progress is being made, so impact is happening over time. Then they've a big piece of work around their student success advisors, and so they identified 259 students who were at risk because they hadn't been in contact with their personal tutors, and so that information was then passed on to the student success advisors, and 180 of them were then contacted and kind of responded to the student success advisors. What we don't know from that is what happens. So is there a kind of a longer term impact? Did that improve those students' outcomes? And Harriet Watt said that they're currently collecting the evidence or developing approaches to collect that evidence of impact. There's some interesting sort of examples of perhaps additional learning that came out of the work that was taking place at Edinburgh Napier in their law programme about understanding the kind of barriers to engagement for minority students in law. And they found that the students thought that the course was very white and viewed the legal profession as very middle class, which is perhaps not particularly surprising. But what's interesting there is that the law team itself is actually described here as being very ethnically diverse. But the students felt that the academics paid very little attention to the different worldviews and cultures. So this seems to show, this times sort of transmits to students the idea that actually minorities are not particularly important. So they're kind of unseen and unimportant. So, and I think that's a really interesting finding, because certainly in the English context, there's a huge concern about the attainment of VME students. And one of the things which is being raised constantly is about having greater staff diversity who will act as role models. But what the students are saying is here and therefore has huge potential to contribute to enhancing the student experience, is that actually just having a diverse staff team, if they still teach a very white curriculum or a very middle class curriculum, then that actually reinforces the lack of diversity, in this case in the legal profession. So it's those kind of insights that I think could be really helpful in sort of moving things forward. So to really use the model, but also to think about what else we learn. So what are the challenges and shortcomings? There's a number of things, and I just want to draw attention to really Some people have tended to focus on the interventions rather than on the role of evidence. So lots of description about the activities that have been put in place. And sometimes it's quite hard to see what the role of evidence is. And this is the evidence for enhancement theme. So it needs to be clear about whether it's evidence that led to the development of the intervention, or whether the intervention is about evidence explicitly, or whether evidence is being used to evaluate and improve, or to scale up, or whatever. Overall, I think there's a lack of evaluative evidence, and this is kind of due partly to time lag and between when the activities happen and when impact occurs. But as I say, I think we can really all have impact in the short term, those short-term benefits, and collect that kind of feedback from people involved, and then look at those other indicators around sort of what have staff gone away and done differently, or how have students behaved differently as a result of doing that. We really need to kind of focus on those things before, as part, moving forward rather. I think students are still fairly peripheral in the work, although in some cases there are some really good exceptions of how students have been actively involved in the work, and certainly some of the collaborative clusters have done that. What strikes me though from the evaluation reports that we've got at the moment is that they're still kind of works in progress, and just because they've been submitted, there might be a value in kind of updating and providing that additional information about impacts which have occurred beyond the point that they've been submitted. So that might be something we need to think about moving forward. So moving forward is kind of the point of the next slide, really, and just about the end of what I want to say. Oh, sorry, BME, thank you for filling that one in. Yeah, so we've got more than 70% of the evaluations still need to be completed and to demonstrate impact or otherwise. So we still have a huge amount of evaluation evidence to collect and to write up and to share and subsequently to analyse. And I'm saying, it's about demonstrating impact, but equally, if we find it doesn't work, that's really important learning. So it's not just about impact at all cost. It is about saying what's happened and using the evidence to either prove that things work or prove that things don't work, or that it appears to have less impact or to work in the way we thought it would, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think we need to, moving forward with those remaining 70% of evaluations, we need to make sure we're not simply describing the interventions. We really need to be clear about the role of evidence, and to present the evidence on the short-term benefits and the medium-term outcomes, and ideally to think about the longer-term impact. If you haven't got that longer term impact because of the time scale, then really clear indicators about what you think will happen moving forward would be really helpful. And I think it's really valuable to capture that unintended learning or consequences that come out of those interventions. I would really like to kind of follow up on the existing light touch evaluations to share any additional evidence that comes to light. And just that last kind of bullet point, which I can't see, but hopefully you can, is that the final dates are the 30th of April that you have to have the first draft of your final report in, and we would really want as much of that evaluation evidence captured in that as possible. And then the final date for submission is the 19th of June. We'll only be able to use the information from the first date going forward into the conference, so it's really quite tight. It's probably about 7 months, isn't it, of kind of that we've still got to work on it. So I think at that point I shall hand it over to you to raise any questions or issues or concerns, or indeed to share the things that have been going well.
Thanks, Liz. If anybody has any questions, I can see Nicola's typing something. If you could just type the questions into the text box at the bottom left, and Liz will answer them.
She will attempt to answer. Okay, that's a That's a great question about whether the 30th of April is the deadline for the evaluation reports. As soon as you've got them, I'd love to have them, because the earlier I can see them, the easier it will be. So it's been really good to have the ones that we've already had. And I appreciate everyone giving them, submitting them early. So yes, I mean, you can send them directly to me and copy in Claire. I think that's probably the most useful way to do it. And then at least make a reference to them in the final reports. Do you want to add anything on that, Claire, about the final reports and the evaluation reports?
Probably just to re-emphasise what you've said, Liz, the 30th of April is really the first deadline we're looking for, and that's to have a draft of the end of year 3, end of theme reports from institutions, and at the moment we don't have a template for that. But as part of that, we would be expecting institutions to submit any of their light touch case studies that they haven't already given to you. But I think, just to reiterate what Liz has said, if you're finishing any light touch case studies between now and then, don't hold on to them. Please send them to QAA Scotland and to Liz, because then we can start really drawing together the kind of overview and the summary of all the impact information we've got. And then, following on from April, the 19th of June is the final date for finalising the evaluation report and the end of year 3, end of theme report. So that's a really good point about timings and not holding on to any evaluation evidence you've got. Please send that to us.
Yeah, and then Nicholas asking about whether there's a template for the in-depth evaluations. There's not a template in quite the same way, but there's a kind of a sheet that takes you through the process and helps you to, well, hopefully helps you to sort of set out what you're going to do. And then it's really up to you to kind of probably use those headings to write it up. But if that doesn't work, because clearly projects are all a little bit different, but the idea would be to set out your kind of theory of change, so what you think is happening. It starts with a title and then a description, and then what your activities are, and then what your theory of change is, and then what your short-term indicators are, your medium-term indicators, and your longer-term indicators. And it asks you things around whether you're having a baseline and that. So you should have had that, but we can certainly send that again.
Are there any other questions? I can see Nicholas typing again. Are there any other questions from anyone as well? If there's nothing else from anybody else, then I would suggest that we close the session there. We'd like to just take the opportunity to thank all of you for participating today, and especially to Liz Thomas for that presentation, which I think was very helpful for me. We're assessing our own work at this end as well at QAA, so I found that very helpful. We'll be putting the video from this website up from this webinar up on the Enhancement Themes website soon, and we'd obviously encourage you to share the webinar with any colleagues who you think might benefit from this content who didn't get to see it today. Just see, is there somebody else typing just now? Oops, it's changing slides. Great. Thanks.
Okay, well, hopefully we can share more things. The only other kind of comment, which is that some people haven't given us permission to share their information. So when you're completing your light touch evaluations, it would be really helpful if you can give us permission to share, because it is really useful for people to see these examples.
Okay. Well, thanks to all of you for being here, and I hope you found it useful, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.